Recording. Okay, so welcome everyone and good afternoon. I'm Miriam Anderson. I'm the board member and the treasurer of the World Affairs Council Tacoma. We are we're a group of volunteer board members, people who believe in international diplomacy, trade, politics, and we love talking about the topics that are very current, important for us. This program is coordinated with the State Department and also with Tacoma Create. We're very grateful to have Irina as our point of contact at the State Department because she has been an unbelievable, amazing contact and supporter for us who try to recruit wonderful speakers. So I'm going to give her a quick minute to Irina so she can introduce herself, and then she's going to show a kind of 1-minute video that State Department would like to share with us. Irina, go ahead, sweetie.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be back speaking with you all. My name is Irina Karmenova. I work with the Office of Public Liaison. It lives within the Bureau of Global Public Affairs at the State Department. And our mission is to facilitate dialogue between the American public and our experts on various foreign policy topics. And we do this with World Affairs Councils, Rotary Clubs, Kiwanis Clubs, universities, high schools, diaspora organizations, civil society organizations, you name it. You know, because there are so many folks out there that are just really interested in what it is that we do or have no idea what it is that we do. And this two-way dialogue is really crucial to kind of demystify what our diplomats do overseas and have a conversation, have a Q&A. And so we're really thrilled to have Kim Furnish here today. American Citizen Services is, you know, absolutely crucial all around the world. And so many Americans don't even know the extent of what we do there. You know, she can also talk about hostage diplomacy a little bit as far as our topic here today. But before I turn it over to you to introduce her, I'm just going to play a 1-minute long video for the folks that don't already know this, but obviously based on your illustrious group, you know, I doubt that will be the case, but just play it real quick and then I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rena.
It's a wonderful and complex world out there, filled with challenges and opportunities. That's why America's diplomats with the U.S. Department of State are on the job every day, representing you. We are advancing America's foreign policy interests by uniting our allies, confronting our adversaries, and protecting our citizens. We advance democracy, human rights, global health, and more. We grow markets that create American jobs. We are America's first federal agency, and we're in 190 countries at over 270 U.S. embassies and consulates, serving you. We are the United States Department of State.
Well, thank you again, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Rena. I love this short video. It's very sweet. Also, I would like to acknowledge Madame Kathleen Pierman. She is an honorary consul of Hungary in Washington State and also former president of Washington State Consulate Association. Kathleen, thank you for coming. We always very much appreciate your support. With that, I would like to give the floor to our speaker, Kimberly Furnish. She's going to talk today about the hostage diplomacy and politics, which has been a very current and important subject nowadays. Kimberly has the most amazing background and traveling experience. And so I'm going to give her time to introduce herself and also talk about the hostage diplomacy and politics. She's going to talk about for about 20 minutes, 25 depends on what information she would like to share. After that, I will open the floor for questions. So you can post the questions in the chat room. And I will ask the person if you would like to ask in person, or I will do the question myself. So with that, I would like to ask Kimberly to take over the floor and introduce yourself and then introduce the subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. I'm really honored to be with such an esteemed group of people. I hope I can at least bring you some new information today. We obviously have a lot of diplomatic experts in this conversation. So with that caveat, I will do my very best to tell you a little bit about what's going on here and now about hostage diplomacy. Not the lightest topic, but certainly very timely and challenging, of course, in the current environment. I'll just introduce myself very briefly. My name is Kim Furnish. I guess I've been with the Department of State about 17 years. I first came to the Department of State. My husband had joined the Foreign Service. He's now my ex-husband. But at the time, he was working in the Caribbean as a consular officer. We all have to do a consular tour. And you have to pick which aspect of diplomatic work you want to do with the State Department as you're taking the exam to get in. So I watched my ex-husband, Bill, handle Caribbean cases, consular cases. So cases that involved U.S. citizens who were in a lot of trouble or, and sometimes in harm's way. Sometimes he could help them, sometimes he could not. It was during the time that, unfortunately, poor Natalie Holloway went missing in Aruba. And I watched him manage that case. And as you all know, our consular officers overseas have very intimate, direct, one-to-one contact with the families of U.S. citizens who are in distress. And it was an incredibly challenging time, of course, for her family, for my ex-husband, for the consulate that was there helping the case, for the law enforcement officers, everyone. And one day during it, I listened to him on a phone call, and he hung up and he said, "Oh, I can't wait not to be a consular officer anymore." And I said, "Oh my gosh, I can't wait to be a consular officer." There's just something about the bug that bit me. And I knew right away that while visas and international travel are interesting to me, I wanted to be the person on the ground overseas helping US citizens. And it's just such a direct way to help America I found my calling, and have never regretted it. Have loved the work ever since. I've had the opportunity to do it in diverse places, in all kinds of scenarios with all kinds of governments, and challenging times and not. And I really, really love it. One thing I've learned is that I never know enough. And you will surely see that here today. There'll be questions that I don't know how to answer, questions that I'm continuously researching, and have teams of people here helping me figure out the answers to, and I then feed to my many, many bosses. Because if there's something true about the State Department, you always have so many bosses, no matter how long you've been in and how senior you think you are. There's always someone who's doing something at a higher level and working on something so important. And it's part of what makes it exciting, and part of what makes it incredibly stressful. So I guess the gist of that is to tell you that I love working with US citizens. And I went from, a vice consul who, did the day-to-day work, to managing US citizens, officers overseas. And now here in Washington, D.C., I'm the director of American Citizen Services. So it's the domestic office that helps run consular sections and embassies overseas. So what's really neat about this job is that I get to see from a bird's eye view the issues of every consular section that we manage in the world, right? So the problems that they encounter on behalf of US citizens, the kind of trouble that US citizens find themselves in. And my biggest takeaway from this is that no matter how much we want to, and no matter how much the White House would like us to put a tracking device on every single US citizen that goes overseas, we cannot control what US citizens decide to do. And we are often left on the other end holding the bag when things go very, very wrong for them. And that's okay. And that's why we're there. And I've always trained my officers to consider whether they're making a death call or they're calling with good news. Pretend that's your mom, your sister, your brother on the other end of that phone, because it very well could be. because we find ourselves in these positions. And what never ceases to give me shivers and goosebumps is that it's the highest priority of the Department of State to help American citizens overseas. And that is the top talking point of everyone, from the secretary on down. It is what we do. Americans are our business. And it just gives me chills and such great faith in our nation that we do this, and then we're overseas in such great capacity for our citizens. So I'll digress and hope that I don't bore you today, but you can't really talk about problems overseas without talking about prevention first, which is a big part of my job. So we utilize travel.state.gov, which is the State Department's primary website for U.S. citizens traveling abroad. Via that website and via social media and via the internet, we put out all kinds of travel advice for U.S. citizens. And we encourage them to register in step.state.gov, the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program. Through that program, people let us know where they're going to be overseas, how long they might be there, and they'll start receiving individual messaging from that embassy or consulate about the situation on the ground. It's the policy of the Department of State and the United States to practice no double standard. That means that if we get security information that might put official Americans at risk in a foreign country, we are obligated to inform private U.S. citizens of that risk. And it's something that the State Department and Consular Affairs, for whom I work, take very, very seriously, that no double standard is practiced across the board and with non-political point of view. It's important, the most important thing, that Americans have the same information that we might have for our official U.S. citizens overseas. So if you go on travel.state.gov, you can put in a country that you might be interested in traveling to, and you can see all of our most recent travel advice on that country. You can see the historical travel advice on that country. You can see recent updates on things that you might have questions about. The travel advisories for countries that are higher risk, we call them level 3 and 4, are updated every 6 months, or when we have information that might cause us to update them. Travel advisories for countries who are lower risk, we update annually, or again, when we have more information about them. We also put out alerts on any number of subjects, from don't forget to vote to there could be a potential terrorist attack in this country, in this city, and we're concerned about it and we want to let you know. So there's a wide range of information that's available there, and it's constantly updated. And we are constantly trying to leverage and amplify that information through social media and other influencers to get it out there, because it's really important that U.S. citizens see this information. And we're constantly working and brainstorming on how to get our information seen more broadly, and how we can better inform Americans before they travel, not when they're in trouble, when they after they've traveled. Along with that, we have a set of what we call indicators for countries, and this is particularly important to this conversation. We call the T indicator for terrorism, the H indicator is for hostage taking, and the D indicator is our most recent indicator, and that stands for wrongful detention. So if you go to our website and you pull up a specific country, you might see that they have, let's say North Korea, for instance. They have many of those indicators on their travel advisory. And so that is another way that we're working to make sure that Americans know, hey, look, there is a high incidence of hostage taking in this country. We want you to be armed and aware before you travel overseas that this happens. So it's of the highest importance to keep our folks advised before they travel. And another top area that comes up frequently for me is what our consular officers, and really our officers abroad in general, whether they're political or whatever, what the U.S. Embassy can and cannot do for you in an emergency once you've traveled. I think people see a lot of movies and films. They see somebody put on a State Department jacket and they have a gun, and there's teams of people, and it doesn't exist. And I wish I could tell everyone in the whole world, that's not going to happen. Please think better of this. So what can we do for you? We can replace your lost or stolen passport. We can contact your family or friends or employers with your permission, of course. We can provide information to facilitate access to medical care. We can address emergency needs as the result of a crime. We can explain financial assistance options and sometimes facilitate that assistance. We can provide information about local points of contacts in the host country who can help explain their laws. And to a certain extent, we can help explain those laws. We can share the status of your case with local criminal justice and the process when applicable. We can connect you to overseas resources for victims of crime. And we can provide you for a list of local lawyers who speak English. We hope. Sometimes that changes at erratic rates. What we cannot do is, more challengingly, we cannot investigate crimes. We cannot provide you legal advice. We cannot represent you in court. We cannot serve as an official interpreter or translator. And we cannot pay legal expenses and other expenses for you. So those are doozies. And I think a lot of folks don't understand that our consular services are actually limited by the Vienna Convention on Consular Affairs, which in Article 5 talks about reciprocity of services between consular officers. So a lot of folks don't understand that, I don't understand, why isn't my country charging in and storming in and doing this for me? Well, it's actually because of the Vienna Convention and reciprocal relationships with countries that define consular work. So it's sometimes complicated for folks to understand that. So that's a little bit about consular affairs in general and about prevention before you travel overseas, which is a huge area of focus. Communication, messaging to U.S. citizens, it's a huge focus of what we do here in consular affairs. The other side of what we do, we sometimes call crisis or special citizen services or service to U.S. citizen, and that's when something has happened, right? And has happened to a group of U.S. citizens, whether it's a mass evacuation or it's an individual citizen, and that's the other side of our business. So what we do when what we dared to hope wouldn't happen has happened, when the worst has happened. So that kind of brings us to hostage taking, kidnapping, wrongful detention, and coercive travel restrictions. Such a light-hearted topic today. So in terms of hostage legislation, the U.S. executive branch undertook a review of policy from about 2014 to 2015 over about a course of 6 months, the results of which were the Executive Order 13698. And it took a harder stance on hostage taking and created the Hostage Resource Group. And among the Hostage Resource Group was the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell and the appointment of a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. Those two particular offices became very critical in the way that the United States addresses hostage taking in particular, and then at a slightly later date, wrongful determination. So that was a pretty critical point in terms of in terms of the way the U.S. addresses hostage taking. A second critical point was December 2020, when Congress passed the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act. That act really came more into play this past summer when it gave more authorities to the, I'm going to say from time to time, SPIHA, but that's the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. And the job is currently filled by Roger Carstens, who's a presidential appointee, interestingly appointed in the Trump era and reappointed by Biden. So he actually spanned the two administrations, which makes him very interesting, dynamic individual, former special forces in the military, and really interesting diplomat. So he currently holds that position. So if you hear me reference SPIHA, I will try very hard not to speak in acronyms because I can't stand it myself. But if I say SPIHA, I'm talking about Roger Carstens, who's our special presidential envoy. A lot of what you see in the news these days in terms of Americans overseas who may have been brought back, a lot of that is coming out of the SPIHA office, the envoy's office, and the work that his staff do. We work in tandem in consular affairs with the presidential envoy's office, but our responsibilities are pretty different. So I'll go into that a little bit later in the session. But first, I kind of wanted to define, or at least I wouldn't claim to think that you all don't have your own definitions of these terms, but from the U.S. government perspective, define hostage. So it means a U.S. national who, by a non-state actor, is abducted or held against their will outside the United States in order to compel a third person or government organization to do or abstain from doing any act, an explicit or implicit condition of release. So we typically associate hostages these days with acts of terrorists, so non-state actors. Then, of course, we have the term kidnapping. It means the unlawful seizure, confinement, abduction, or carrying away or holding for ransom, rewards, or otherwise of any U.S. national, except in the case of a minor held by a parent or legal guardian. And then finally, we have wrongful detention, which is a newer term for me in terms of diplomacy. So wrongful detention refers to certain cases of when a U.S. national is detained by a foreign government that the Secretary of State has assessed to be wrongful. And these are primarily folks who are held by a foreign government. And that is, in the U.S. terms, the U.S. government terms, is a big differentiation between hostage and wrongfully detained. So when we speak of wrongfully detained Americans, we're saying Americans who have been possibly detained by a government through their official channels. When someone is a hostage, they are detained by a terrorist or other extremist group that are non-government affiliated to a certain extent. So bear with me on this. When we talk about all of these horrible situations, we always have to go back to the privacy of U.S. citizens. It is something that is inherent to our work, and often when folks are wrongfully detained or hostages, they don't have the ability to fill out what we call a Privacy Act, and it can hinder what the U.S. government can say about them to anyone. So we have, as we look at these cases, we have to work very, very closely with attorneys, family members, and others to make sure that we're adhering to the Privacy Act and not breaking the privacy laws of these U.S. citizens. It's very, very tricky, and it's not something that is widely talked about in the press, except to the fact that you might see the State Department saying something like, we cannot comment on that individual as a private U.S. citizen. And it likely means it's because we don't have a Privacy Act waiver to discuss their case with the press or with Congress or even with their family. So it makes the cases interesting because often you're reading what you might read in the press about certain cases, and many of them are hugely popular in the press. But often although we are working every day on those cases, and sometimes 24/7, we can't speak about them because we have to respect the privacy of the American individual who is detained, and it makes it challenging. So a little bit on the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell. That is an FBI-led initiative. It's an interagency initiative. Again, it was established by Obama in about 2013, 2014. That Fusion Cells is located inside the FBI headquarters here in Washington, D.C. And their charge, again, is looking after and combining intelligence on any U.S. citizen who is a hostage, who we consider to be a hostage, so someone who was taken by an extremist or terrorist entity. So among that Fusion Cell sit there are 3 State Department seats. There are seats for the CIA, the FBI, the Treasury, because often their work involves sanctions on foreign countries. So there are several seats for the Treasury. The rotation of the chair of the Fusion Cell rotates among the agencies, although I will admit it's a very FBI-influenced cell simply because of its location and inherent to the work. But it was a big step in terms of hostage engagement for the United States to develop that. And I've been really excited to see the work that group has done. One huge part of the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell is the family engagement specialist. And the woman who's occupied that position for as long as I can remember doesn't come from any particular agency. She's agency-less, she rises above it. So any sort of bureaucracy that happens between the agencies, she's above that, and she's a specialist in helping US citizens and their families and engaging with them. An important aspect to hostage taking is that there are resources, financial resources available to the families to help them travel to Washington, D.C., or even to abroad. Let's say there's good news and their U.S. citizen is brought home, or in the process of being brought home, they're often transported to whatever location they might be meeting their family member. And there's funding also available for the hostage, the person who was the hostage themselves after they've been returned. So that's a big, important part of hostage taking and recovery. So we sometimes describe that there are 4 stages of a hostage case. There's the initial hostage taking or transition from another form of captivity. There's the period of captivity. There's the resolution of captivity, which sometimes can be a release. It can be recovery, or it can be the death of the hostage. And then there's post-captivity support. So there's support for the family, and then in post-captivity support for the U.S. citizen who was detained throughout all of that. And there's different aspects of federal government work that assist in all of those stages. And when we are lucky enough to see a recovery, it's really kind of a beautiful thing to watch all of those resources come together for a U.S. citizen who has been detained and then released. And I'm proud to say the U.S. government is quite good at that transition and assisting U.S. citizens who have sometimes been held overseas for many, many, many years. So that's sort of the life cycle of a hostage case. When we talk about kidnappings, inside the U.S. government, we call them KFRs, kidnapping for ransom. That is what you these days would more typically see. We see them more in the Western Hemisphere than anywhere else in the world right now. It's very common in Haiti and some Latin and South American countries. And it's typically a U.S. citizen who might be overseas and be determined to have some wealth or influence. And it is almost always for money, a return of money from the family. And those are cases that are exclusively handled by Consular Affairs. They do not rise to hostage taking unless something has happened that increases the hostageness of the case, and they are typically not considered wrongful detentions. Those are typically shorter term cases that are resolved and without the help of the U.S. government, essentially. We give them consular services, we advise them, we send them to legal resources, we can advise them on conditions in the country. But most often that is something that is resolved in a number of days or weeks, and usually through a private ransom through the family. So I'll move through that. And then we come to wrongful detention, which I think is probably the most sort of like sexy talked about type of hostage taking activity these days, because when we talk about it, we're talking about the most recent cases in Russia or Venezuela. So as I said before, wrongful detention is something that we've come to consider a case where a U.S. citizen is detained by a foreign government for wrongful reasons, a lack of being more poetic. And it's something I think that we see growing and of great concern, and a big part of the reason we have the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell and the Special Presidential Envoy's Office. Now, SPIHA, Roger Carstens and his team, they take the lead on wrongful detention cases. So what happens is, under the Levinson Act, the State Department is required to continuously evaluate the arrests of U.S. citizens abroad. And we look for specific indicators as laid out in the Levinson Act to determine whether or not we suspect that this person is being wrongfully detained. We then come inside, and through a process in the State Department, typically a cable is written from overseas, from the Post, about this particular individual, and through an internal process, the the Secretary of State will be advised that this is this packet of information. We're concerned this person is being wrongfully detained. Only the Secretary of State and his or her designee can determine someone wrongfully detained. And that is how that process works, and that is laid out by the Levinson Act. Once a U.S. citizen overseas is determined to be wrongfully detained, the case moves from a traditional consular case in which we're continuously providing services, hopefully have access to that U.S. citizen, making sure that their needs and wants are cared for to the extent that we can. It moves from a consular case to a case under the Special Presidential Envoy's office. A distinct difference between our offices is that they are not hindered by the Vienna Convention. That office can advocate for the release of a U.S. citizen who may be wrongfully detained overseas. So that's a lot of what you're seeing happening in the news. And it's incredibly tricky. It's the diplomacy here is, look, if I weren't sitting in the chair and if I could speak to you on my personal opinions, it would be a fascinating conversation, right? Because it's not always in the best interest of a U.S. citizen to be in the press all the time, right? Especially if a foreign government may be holding them for what they consider to be newsworthy or wrongful or for other purposes that may hurt the United States or they think or they're hurting the United States for, right? On the other side of the coin, these are U.S. citizens who are wrongfully detained in a foreign country, and there are U.S. citizens. And so as a consular officer, in my heart of hearts, I would love to commandeer a jet and go pick them up and bring them home, right? Every single one of them. And then you have the thousands of U.S. citizens who are overseas and in jail, and they're not wrongfully detained. They broke a law. Fair or not, miserable or not, it is consular affairs' jobs to make sure that those people are safe, healthy, cared for to the extent of the law that that country will allow, that it's commensurate with the U.S. legal system. But it is not the position of the U.S. government to advocate for their release from prison, because when you travel overseas, you must follow and obey the laws of that country, right? So the distinction between being wrongfully detained and just being detained, especially in the eyes of the families of folks who love them, can be very thin and complicated. And that's what makes my day-to-day job very hard, because my heart goes out to all of these people. I would love for no U.S. citizen to be detained overseas for any reason. So that's where we stand in terms of hostage taking, wrongful detention, and the current climate. I think you can probably see some of the bad actors that we discuss are, Russia, Venezuela, among others. And so that is a challenge and fascinating side of U.S. diplomacy. And I would love to buy each of you a glass of wine someday when I'm no longer an official U.S. diplomat and discuss some of this. And to the extent that I can today answer questions. I think it's fascinating. I think it's sad. And I think it's a little scary, quite frankly. So what are some of the criteria that we use to determine wrongful detention? There is disparate or discriminatory treatment due to your U.S. connection. You're being detained as a bargaining chip by a foreign government because you're a U.S. citizen. Arbitrary detention is the deprivation of an individual's right to liberty in violation of a covenant on civil liberties. There is torture or inhumane or degrading treatment occurring in your detention. And we assess something that we very vaguely call the totality of the circumstances for that particular prisoner. We look for significant concerns with the local judicial system. Are there due process concerns? Is there denial of a fair trial? Do we have consular access to this individual? And then lastly, innocence, among the many other things, comes into play. Is the subject innocent? Do we believe this person to be innocent? And in many times they're not innocent, but perhaps the sentence which they've been delivered is inherently more harsh than we would have delivered for the similar sentence in the United States, so much so that it's deemed wrongful. So those are some of the criteria. I'm not a lawyer. I have very, very smart lawyers around me, as does the Secretary of State. And, you know, I have to tell you that the Levinson Act is a new law. Wrongful detention is new to the United States in terms of legal definitions. So it's still something I think the State Department is taking through the process and learning about ourselves. So it's fascinating. It's a fascinating time in terms of the way the USG looks at wrongful detention and hostage taking, and exciting in some ways. Also scary to see what's happening in the world. At risk of, I just want to make sure I covered everything that I wanted to talk to y'all about. And then I'll turn it. I think I won't bore you with any other legalese. I think that kind of summarizes where we are in terms of U.S. government. And I do think we're seeing an increase in hostage and wrongful detentions of Americans overseas. Our focus is most definitely on prevention and trying to reach U.S. citizens before things like this happen to them, and messaging to U.S. citizens that you are not above the law, and sometimes those laws are not fair in countries that you might be going to. We're also cognizant that a lot of these cases happen with dual nationals. So people who, for instance, might be a national of the country that they're wrongfully detained in, but also a U.S. citizen. Those are particularly challenging because often those countries consider those nationals of their country first and only, right? And may or may not recognize their U.S. citizenship. But across the board, to us, they're U.S. citizens no matter what, right? If you're a dual or tri-national, we don't care. You're a U.S. citizen, and we want to help you. And so we do see an awful lot of dual nationals affected by some of these rules and regulations. I didn't go too far into coercive travel restrictions. That's a little bit of something that we might see in places like China, and affects dual nationals to a larger extent in terms of exit bans, not allowing them to leave the country for what we would consider coercive reasons to keep them there. And so we do see an awful lot of that around the world as well. Coercive travel restrictions do not always rise to the level of wrongful detention. And so many of these are a case-by-case basis in terms of the legal side. But what it comes back to is these are people, there are people, and we are a bureau of helping people. It's what we do. So we are constantly reevaluating these cases. If we've had a case that we've considered as a potential wrongful determination and put it through our internal process and it just wasn't there yet, we will reconsider it 5 days later if new information comes to light, to potentially make that wrongful determination. The other side to the coin is, although we've seen some recent successes through the SPIHA, the Envoy Office, in gaining the release of U.S. citizens, it's not a guarantee to be released once you've been determined wrongfully detained. It doesn't mean that we'll be successful in terms of negotiation with a foreign country to have a wrongfully detained U.S. citizen released. I think a lot of times families especially think, if I could just get my U.S. citizen determined this way and get to the SPIHA office, everything will be okay. And I sometimes shudder a little bit on the inside because I think I don't ever want to give a U.S. citizen false hope. The other side has a vote. We know what we want, but the other side has a vote. And that is a challenging thing. And managing expectations of U.S. citizens and their families is a huge part of my job as well. So I will stop talking and answer questions. I hope that gave you guys just a little bit. Again, I'm hesitant to, this is such a wonderful group of people. You probably know more about hostage taking than I do. So thank you for your due diligence of listening to me, and I'm happy to answer questions if I can. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Kimberly. It's a very extensive subject, and I'm sure we cannot talk about some details about the current hostage situation about the specific people. I understand. I'm going to start with a question, and we have a couple of people who have a question already posted. I just want to compliment State Department, the effort they do, because I am from Georgia, Republic of Georgia, and I was there in 2008 with my husband and my 6 months old son when the invasion happened. So 2 days before our departure, Russia invaded and the whole country was shut down, and there was no way for us to escape. So I tried for 1 week to figure out what to do, how to do. And then my friend contacts me. She's Jewish, sits on the computer all the time, and my travel agent contacts me and say, hey, there's a convoy at US Embassy. I can say enough thank you to State Department, the work they put in order to take literally every possible American out of Georgia to Armenia. So there were like 6 convoy of buses, and there were 50 people in each bus sitting and taking every single citizen through the borders, putting them in Armenia in a kind of Airbnbs and hotels and everything. And I even got a call before when I came to the United States and flew back, and I got a call. What do you do? I have no idea, but my head's off. Thank you, Kimberly. So my question would be, yeah, it's just, it's admiration. Sometimes people don't understand the work you do, but literally every bus had 6 people assigned from the State Department and from the embassy, and to make sure that we all got safe home. It was unbelievable. Logistically, it was unbelievable to do it, but you did a fantastic job. Thank you for your service. My question to you would be, so when the people come back from either they are wrongfully detained or they are hostages, they successfully come back to the United States. What happened to them? Do they go through a certain protocol process first, and then are they able to travel again to other countries or to the country they were detained or wrongfully detained, or they were holding the hostage?
Absolutely. Through the FBI, there's an extensive, I'm trying to remember the name of the program that they get, source of funding and counselors and therapies. Often when folks are brought back, it's through military bases, right? So their first location might be to land at a U.S. military base or a foreign military, our U.S. military base in a foreign location. So, you know, the days following for instance, a hostage, let's talk about a standard hostage return. You know, it's typically by a military plane, and they're first met by a psychologist who specializes in this. You know, they need to see medical doctors. They need to be, you know, reintroduced to nutrition frequently. They need to be treated for other issues, especially if they've aged in prison, right? And so they might have other medical issues that we're not aware of. So you're looking at the psychosocial medical side of it. Often they're not ready to speak to their family members right away. It's something that I was surprised to see. You know, they're given the choice to right away. Some wait days, some wait weeks. Some say, I never want to speak to my family again. It's an interesting side of this, because I think a lot of times families think that if a family had problems before a detention, that somehow that went away because they were so worried about their loved one. But for that loved one, sometimes those feelings just haven't dissipated. They still don't want to have anything to do with their families, despite all the work that family might have done to advocate for their release. So that's interesting as well. And so sometimes we're limited. They won't sign a Privacy Act waiver for us to talk with their family, et cetera, about their current condition. So that happens. And when they come back stateside, they are given even further services through Health and Human Services to reintegrate, sometimes job placement, counseling. You know, I'd like to think it's a substantial program. They again are private U.S. citizens, and you know, they can travel wherever they want to and feel up to traveling. We had someone recently who came out of detention, and that individual wanted to travel immediately to a third country where he believed he had a wife, but that was actually no longer the case. And because of the funds this person had and the view from that particular country, we did have to warn this person that we were concerned that they might get turned around at the border and not be allowed to enter the country. So we couldn't have prevented this person from going, but we wanted to make sure he was aware, like, look, this could be hard for you during a troubling time. Like, you might want to consider going back to the U.S. and recouping a little bit. And but no, they can travel wherever they want. And there are definitely cases of U.S. citizens who have traveled back into extremist hands. yes, that has occurred. And of course, there are no limitations on any private U.S. citizens' travel. So to answer your question, yes, they can and do travel, and sometimes, against the advice of the U.S. government to places where there's an extreme environment. So,
thank you, Kimberly. Hans, you have a question. Do you want to ask the question? Do you want me to pose the question about Americans serving the time when they come back? Or... Okay, you can unmute yourself, Hans.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, a question. Is it possible for, say, someone being held in an overseas prison to who maybe deserves to be there, at least for violating laws, do they ever get a chance to come back and serve that time here? I mean, is that even possible?
Oh yeah, it's absolutely possible. We have prisoner transfer treaties with most nations that we have diplomatic relations with. And so yes, I worked in Korea, as an example, South Korea, and we had a lot of prisoners who requested prisoner transfer and went through that process and served the rest of their time in U.S. prisons. So yes, that's absolutely possible. There's a set of, a process that they have to go through. It's a program run by the Department of Justice, but it happens with some frequency, yes. And, it's usually because they just want to be closer to family, right? And to be able to visit with family. If they're detained overseas and they don't have family in that country, that's typically why folks would like to do that. Part of the treaty agreement is, though, that we guarantee that they'll get the full sentence that they would have served in the other country. So I think sometimes prisoners falsely think that that they're going to get a lesser sentence in the United States, even though we tell them it's not going to happen. I think they want to roll that dice and take that chance. So, but yes, it happens. Yeah. It happens all the time.
Thank you.
John, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, yeah. So I guess you can't really discuss specific cases, but I wonder if you could discuss generally what kinds of tactics or things you do in a hostage situation that have been successful. I mean, what are the most promising things you can do to help someone in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's about internal diplomatic relations, right? So it's really our officers on the ground in that particular country, or sometimes it's a protecting power. If it's a place where we don't have diplomatic relations, we have to rely on our protecting power to help negotiate those issues. And sometimes it's just nature's course. I think sometimes hostage takers think that this person has no longer served their purpose for whatever reason and release them. Sometimes it's humanity. Sometimes they release them because the person has become too ill or aged. That's another scenario when the hostage becomes too difficult for them to even take care of. So we see the release under those circumstances. So I think it's a combination of effects, but I really think like internal diplomacy and the works of our diplomats and our friendly diplomats overseas is really what secures release in so many circumstances.
Okay. Then Marcia, you have a question about the third-party negotiation.
Yeah, periodically you read about private citizens who parachute into situations and begin negotiations. And the one that comes most immediately to mind is Bill Richardson, the former governor of New Mexico, but Jesse Jackson has, and other high-profile individuals. I can't believe how that must complicate your life because you don't know what they're promising or how do you coordinate with those people? Are they Lone Rangers and you're not involved with them, or do you try and coordinate tactics? What do you do with high profile folks like this who want to help but could really mess things up?
Yeah, I know that's a really interesting question. I think there's scenarios where it's done in tandem with USG efforts, and then I think there's times when it's a third party who may have really good intentions. And in certain circumstances like that, I have seen where a very diplomatic phone call from someone in our office to that individual American who's interested in making that sort of travel, that it would not be in the best interests of our detained citizen for you to do that. We also worry about your safety. Ultimately, we cannot tell you what to do, but we just wanted to talk to you a little bit about this before you did it. So I have seen that happen. And in most of the circumstances, people have said, "Oh no, I'm going to cancel the trip." Yeah, and we've seen that happen in recent months even. So it does happen, but there are some cases where it does help the U.S. citizen, and it might be in with the blessing of the USG. So it's a case-by-case circumstance, but we certainly do let private U.S. citizens know who are trying to jump into something that we think is ill-advised, that it's just ill-advised and you might be hurting yourself and the citizen that you're worried about.
Thank you, Kimberly. Tom, you are raising your hand. Please, welcome to pose the question.
Yeah, I was just prompted by the mention of Bill Richardson, who had been my boss when he was the ambassador to the United Nations. And I met with him just last month before he flew off to Russia to try to work on the 2 American citizens who were wrongfully detained, Brittany Grenier and the other fellow's name I forget. And it was
Paul
not
Whelan.
Paul Whelan and Reiner, Jennifer Reiner.
And I was not giving him advice about how to approach that, but he also wanted to talk about nuclear issues while seeing the Russian foreign minister on that trip. The interesting thing to me is now I've kind of seen it from both sides of the equation. I've seen it from the US government view, which I think Kimberly described well, that they see a risk that a private negotiator, even someone with the credibility and the success record, far from a perfect success record, but some successes in getting people out. Somebody like Richardson brings that to the table, but at the same time, as Kimberly noted, could be working at cross purposes to broader US policy interests with Russia. And from Governor Richardson's point of view, it's the coordination with the government that becomes difficult. First, because of who he is, he wants to do it at a higher level than Kimberly, to one of the dozens of bosses that Kimberly mentioned we all have in the State Department, and directly with the White House. And second, because it is difficult for him to get unambiguous guidance from the White House as to what they want. They want to have, if you're sitting in the White House, both deniability, the ability to say that what Richardson is doing is purely private, but you also want to give him some guidance, some red lines, some things that would not be acceptable in any negotiated exchange. And so it gets tough and frustrating for him as well. So I just throw that in because it was interesting for me to hear from him for the first time what the point of view is of somebody who takes these independent initiatives with that are not purely personal, that have some kind of blessing and some kind of aegis from the US government. Thanks.
That is interesting. We've also seen the growth of, I guess you could call them private organizations or non-government organizations. One that comes to mind, and I'm not quoting this officially, is Project Dynamo. It's been interesting in my own capacity privately to read about the work that they're attempting to do overseas. And then, in my work officially, the risks that they're taking and some of the concerns. So it's interesting to watch, and like I said, like any good consular officer, I would love to commandeer a jet and go get some folks. Anyone would. It's just complicated. It's complicated, and the risks are huge for all of us. So it's fascinating to watch for sure. I read about Project Dynamo with some frequency, and then I hear about them with some frequency in my professional world. But they have worked a lot in Ukraine, and I'll leave it at that, in case you want to Google it yourselves.
Continuation of kind of Marsha's question. So when I was kind of doing some research about current hostages we have in Russia, especially, and you came across with the interviews with a coach, like a Brittany Griner's coach, or parents, or like a Hawaiianer's, a Willen parent, something like that.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, does the State Department advises them not to communicate with media? Because sometimes when such an active case, because they can affect all those comments, I'm surely, in a negative way that make the release or negotiations much more complex and much more complicated.
Mhm.
So how do you handle that? How do you communicate with people who are kind of like family members or significant others or coaches to just be quiet?
Yeah.
While the case is still active,
Mhm. I mean, so we don't give that advice. We cannot give that advice.
Mhm.
They are at their free will to do what they see best. They ask us information. We give honest answers, the best that we can, and we go from there. We are available to them domestically and overseas 24/7, and spend a lot of time with these families on the phone, in person, or sometimes from the first people to visit the families once they've learned about the detention. But one thing we can't do is really give advice on that issue. We just don't delve into it. We just talk about the facts of the case and the support that we have, and we go from there. And so oftentimes you'll find the folks that work for me, see someone go to the press and say, the State Department isn't doing anything for me, and that same officer, it's usually our mid-level officers who are amazing and so wonderful. They're going, I just got off the phone with him, I just said how much I cared. I just said, and so it's kind of unforgiving. But at the same time, the family has that outlet and that option. And, it's the United States. It's free speech, so no, I mean, we don't get involved in their decision-making process. We simply can't.
Thank you. Brent, you have a question. Would you like to ask by yourself, or do you want me to pose a question?
Oh, sure. I could ask. Sorry,
Go ahead,
my
Brent.
voice.
Go ahead.
Excuse me. But first, thank you so much for this session. It actually kind of hit me at home when I first saw this announced, because my wife had actually been held hostage in Dubai when she was an Indonesian citizen before she became a U.S. citizen. And so she was essentially trafficked there. She had finished college, and then she was recruited for a hotel, and found out that she was handpicked to be a bride for one of the Saudi owners of the hotel. So her parents essentially spent all of their money and all of the village money that they could find to get her back and pay the hostage ransom. And so thank God she is back, and we're married, and she lives in the U.S. now. But so on the way in this morning, I heard this report on NPR about Filipinos being trafficked here and held hostage in different situations. And it just came to mind that I thought, well, at some level, the Department of State is involved also with mitigating this kind of issue and this tragedy in the U.S. And it's becoming more and more of an issue through several different channels. I just wondered if you could comment on any of that part of, like, the reverse order of somebody actually being trafficked here. How does that work? What's the shell there?
Oh, incredibly tough. I'm so glad that your wife is happy and healthy now, and I'm sorry that she ever went through that. Anyone goes through that. It breaks my heart. In terms of the reversal, it's a much more law enforcement run operation in the United States. So once someone is trafficked here domestically or similar, it becomes law enforcement case. So FBI, DEA, DHS, all take the leads on that kind of casework domestically. Where the State Department might get involved is in the diplomacy of it, right? So if let's say the Philippines, raise the issue in our embassy in the Philippines, And then we would get involved in terms of, relating information back to the Philippines embassy here in DC or to our embassy in the Philippines, to their government, sort of thing. So we would get involved in the diplomacy, but not necessarily the law enforcement side of those types of cases.
Okay. Another question for you, Kimberly. Curious, does somehow the administration, depends who the administration is in the United States, might trigger the frequency of hostages of wrongful detention in that particular period of time? I'm just wondering whether choices of administration we have in the government might trigger, make this hostage situation easy to handle or hard to handle. Like it would take like Iranian hostages in 1979, how that was handled. And then we have as hostages, for example, if I kind of use my personal opinion about bringing Ukraine, it's all about politics here because we are supporters of Ukrainian war, and I'm sure that may be a complicated situation. So that's kind of when we have various administrations can trigger ease or difficulties of utilizing the technique to achieve successful release of hostages or wrongful detainees.
Yeah, well, I think you hit the $1 million question that I probably can't answer. I don't think it's as black and white as that. I think it's a hugely complex issue, right? And so you've seen, over the years, presidents come out and say, we absolutely do not negotiate, with terrorists. We do not, and so there'll be some who see negotiations in some form or another as us backing down on that issue. Others do not. Others see Americans who are hostage or wrongfully detained and think, we have to do whatever we can to help them. So I think that's why, to answer your question, is why we pass laws like the Levinson Act, so that the U.S. government has a law and a guide on how to determine wrongful detention and how the U.S. treats these cases. And that's the best I can answer on that in terms of my official stance. Does that help?
Yeah, that's helpful. That's good. So I want to be respectful to everybody's time. So it's already kind of a little bit past by 1 o'clock. Quick comments to make. So the website you just suggested, Kimberly, we should utilize that website as our resource. And also when we travel overseas, should we utilize this website to register ourselves traveling to this particular country, or what will be the best case to make sure that, the State Department or embassy in that country is aware that we're in that country? Should we use that website?
Yeah, please do. I mean, it even goes down into the weeds of, if you have a certain medication, if that foreign country arrests people frequently for that medication, we're going to tell you on that website, or we're going to direct you to where you can learn about that, right? So I think a lot of people have very in the weeds questions about travel like that. And if you have another question, well, there's a link on there that'll get you to an email that you can reach one of our country officers who's an expert in that country. So we're not really, we're not a 1-800 number, but it is there as a resource to answer questions about travel that I think a lot of people come across. I do, and it's my job. And I think, can I take blank to blank? What do I need a visa? Oh, I should know this, and then I go to travel.state.gov. Frankly, when people ask me, a while back, I had friends that were going to go to Romania, and they were concerned about the war in Ukraine. And I was like, well, did you go read the travel advice on Romania? Let's look it up. Let's see what our expert on the country said. I can't be an expert on every country that Americans travel to every day, but I have 75 people in my office who are, experts on those individual countries and are reading that news and watching what's going on and deciding when we need to send something. So I use it all the time. I'm so glad I know about it. I'm so glad I know about it, especially when I'm not working in this office, right? I work in other departments of the Department of State as well. So yes, please use travel.state.gov. I think it's an awesome resource. And they're always, our PR department's always working on updating it and making it a little bit better. more useful, that sort of thing. So please use it. I do.
Thank you so much. I will kind of make a final comment. So thank you everyone for coming. Kimberly, thank you. It has been a wonderful to listen to you and informed us and educate us. And definitely I'm going to personally make that website is my resourceful website beside, like I usually go like a Rick Steve's website to learn about certain traveling kind of accommodations, but thank you so much. Also, thank you, Irina, and thank you everybody for showing up. So keep in touch, check our websites. We have more very interesting programs coming up, so please do so. And also, if you know somebody can be a good speaker for us, like we know Tom is a great speaker about a very interesting subject, please shoot the email to me and we'll be more than happy to make arrangements for you. Thank you so much and have a lovely day and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you,
Kimberly.
Pleasure talking to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Rena. Thank you, Kathleen, showing up. Thank you, sweetie.
Thank you, everyone.
Good to see you, sweetie. Bye.
Bye.
Marcia, can you stay for a second, please?
Oh, sure.
Let me pause the recording. Where is it? Hold on. Chat and